She stands at Boston Harbor railing, one suitcase, 14 months of separation, one burning question: will he be waiting? A black sergeant and white French prisoner, love born in captivity. Now they discover if it survives freedom. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching and don't forget to subscribe. September 14th, 1944, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Heat hung heavy over the compound, thick enough to taste. Sergeant Marcus Webb stood at the fence, watching transport trucks roll through the gates, with the practiced indifference of a man who had learned early that showing too much interest in anything could be misinterpreted as weakness. He was 28 years old, had grown up in Detroit, where his father worked railroad lines and his mother cleaned houses for families on the East Side. He had learned young how to read rooms, how to move through spaces where his presence created tension, how to make himself useful in ways that kept him safe. The army had seemed like escape from that constant negotiation. It turned out the army was just a different kind of negotiation, one he had gotten exceptionally good at. Colonel Richardson had explained Marcus's reassignment personally. "We need someone who understands discipline, but also understands people," he'd said. "Someone who can communicate across language barriers. Your record shows you can do both." The unspoken part hung between them like smoke. Marcus was useful precisely because he existed in the spaces between categories. Not quite accepted by the white officers, not quite one of the soldiers, liminal, negotiable. The first transport that day carried German male prisoners, exhausted men with hollow eyes who had fought on the wrong side of a war they could see was already lost. Marcus processed dozens of them by the time the afternoon sun started its descent. Then the second transport arrived. The women emerged slowly from the canvas-covered truck, blinking against the sudden brightness. 47 of them, Marcus would learn, German auxiliaries captured during the rapid Allied advance through France. They wore modified military uniforms, hair pulled back in regulation style, despite the suffocating heat. Most were in their 20s or early 30s, though a few looked barely old enough to have finished secondary school. They carried themselves with the stiffness of people trained to endure, their faces carefully blank as they took in their surroundings. But one woman made Marcus pause in his careful observation. She stood third in line, her hair the color of burnished copper catching the late sun, tall, perhaps 5'10", with bone structure that suggested generations of careful European breeding. There was something about the way she held herself, even in captivity, that suggested she had never quite expected to end up in circumstances like this. French, Marcus thought immediately, though he couldn't have explained how he knew. Something about the set of her shoulders, the particular way she seemed to exist slightly apart from the German women around her, even as she stood among them. When their eyes met for just an instant, as the prisoners were marched past, Marcus caught something he couldn't quite name. Wariness, certainly, but also observation. She was assessing the situation with the same careful attention he was bringing to assessing her. That look lasted maybe 2 seconds before she looked away, but in that moment, Marcus understood he had made a mistake. He was cataloguing details he had no business cataloguing. The particular shade of that hair, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the way her hands were clasped together so tightly he could see the tension from 15 feet away. He recognized the feeling immediately and pushed it down with practiced ease. Getting attached to prisoners was a complication, a mistake. Getting attached was exactly the kind of thing that could compromise his position in a world that had only allowed him to advance by being twice as competent and half as visible as the white soldiers around him. The prisoners were marched to the women's compound, a section of the facility that had been hastily but adequately constructed to house them. Simple wooden barracks, a mess hall, a recreation area, all surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. It was secure but not cruel, which seemed to be Colonel Richardson's entire philosophy about how to run a facility like this. Marcus was assigned to evening roll call, a duty that would become routine, but that night felt charged with significance. The women were lined up in formation outside their barracks as the sun dropped lower and the heat began to release its stranglehold on the compound. The interpreter stood ready. Marcus stood slightly to one side, notebook in hand, documenting names and numbers as Captain Sarah Holloway read from her list. The tall woman with the copper hair stood fifth in line. When her name was called, her accent became immediately apparent in her careful repetition. Isabelle Rousseau, born 1918 in Lyon, served as communications specialist, had been transferred twice before arriving at Camp Shelby. Marcus wrote the information down with his usual efficiency, but his pen hesitated slightly on the spelling of her name. He had never known anyone named Isabel. After roll call was complete and the women had been dismissed to their barracks, Marcus stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, feeling the temperature finally beginning to drop. Captain Holloway approached him, her expression thoughtful. She was sharp-eyed, mid-40s, the kind of woman who had fought hard for every position she held. "You did well during processing, Webb. I've reviewed your file. You were in quartermasters before this. That was clearly a waste of your skills." She paused, watching the last of the prisoners file into the barracks. "The colonel has some unusual ideas about how a facility like this should be run, but he's also a fair man. I think you'll find this assignment more interesting than your last one. The women need to be treated with respect, but they also need to understand that we're serious about security and rules. It's a delicate balance." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately what she was really saying, that he had been chosen for this position precisely because of his ability to maintain that balance. That his race, which might have seemed like a liability in other circumstances, was actually valuable here because it meant he understood things about existing in liminal spaces, about being neither fully accepted nor fully rejected. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I understand." Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Morning roll call at 6:30 sharp, work assignments that ranged from kitchen duty to administrative support to laundry detail, evening accountability at 5 o'clock, then the brief recreation period that Colonel Richardson permitted before lights out. The compound slowly transformed from a collection of exhausted, wary women into something resembling an actual community, albeit one constrained by the rules and restrictions of captivity. The German women came from different backgrounds and different understandings of their role in the war. Some had been true believers in Nazi ideology, though exposure to American captivity and the gradual filtering of news from Germany was eroding that conviction. Others had been conscripted or pressured into military service out of necessity rather than conviction. A few had been openly skeptical of the regime the whole time, women who had seen through the propaganda from the beginning, but who had learned that skepticism was dangerous. One woman, a former teacher named Helena Schmidt, had been deliberately vague about her reasons for joining the auxiliary services, but Marcus had pieced together from overheard conversations that she had needed to escape something in Berlin. Another, Marie Hoffman, spoke openly about her doubts regarding the regime, but she was careful only to do so when she was certain no true believers were within earshot. Isabel fell into a category of her own entirely. She had been French before she was a German prisoner, which meant she occupied a space that none of the other women did. Her family had run a textile business in Lyon, and when the Germans occupied France, she had initially tried to continue her work. But occupation had meant many things, and eventually she had found herself working for the Germans in ways that seemed less obviously collaborationist than other options. Communications work, technical skills, the ability to speak multiple languages, which made her valuable in ways she hadn't quite anticipated when she'd first accepted the position. She had been 26 years old when she accepted work as a communications officer for the occupation forces. She had told herself it was practical. The Germans were going to occupy France, whether she cooperated or not. By working in communications, she could potentially protect her family, could keep her textile business operating under German management, It had seemed like a reasonable negotiation with circumstance, but negotiations have a way of expanding beyond their original terms. By 1943, she was handling sensitive communications. By 1944, she was one of the few people in the Lion office who understood the entire communications network. And when the Allies advanced, she was trapped on the wrong side of the lines, swept up with German forces as they retreated, processed as a prisoner of war, and eventually shipped across the Atlantic to a camp in Mississippi. Then the liberation had happened, and she had been caught on the wrong side of the lines, swept up with German forces before she could explain the complicated reality of her situation. By the time she reached Camp Shelby, she carried the peculiar shame of someone who wasn't entirely sure what she should be ashamed of. Marcus noticed these things because noticing things was his job. That was what he told himself. It had nothing to do with the particular quality of attention he found himself bringing to Isabel's movements through the compound, her interactions with the other women, the way she seemed to exist slightly apart from the groups that formed during recreation periods. October arrived in Mississippi with deceptive gentleness. The brutal heat eased marginally, but not enough to make the climate feel anything less than punishing to people accustomed to the cooler temperatures of Europe. It was during a recreation period, a Wednesday afternoon when temperatures had climbed back toward uncomfortable levels, that Marcus first had a real conversation with Isabelle Rousseau beyond the formalities of roll call and work assignments. She was sitting alone in the shade of one of the barracks, attempting to write something in a small notebook. Most of the other prisoners were engaged in various activities. Some were playing a half-hearted game with a ball. Others clustered in small groups, speaking in rapid German that Marcus couldn't follow. But Isabel sat by herself, her pen moving slowly across the paper, her forehead creased in concentration. Marcus told himself he was doing his job. A lone prisoner sitting by herself could indicate depression, which could indicate a security risk. He should check on her well-being. That was his responsibility. "You all right?" he asked, approaching with the kind of casual gait that suggested he was simply passing through rather than specifically seeking her out. Isabel looked up, startled. Her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and then something like resignation. She set down her pen carefully. "I am fine, Sergeant Webb, simply writing letters. I write often, but they send none. Still I write. Perhaps someday they arrive." Her English was careful, each word precisely enunciated, with only the faintest trace of an accent. Not German, French underneath the careful neutrality. Marcus realized that he had been hearing her speak to the German women in their language often enough that he had almost forgotten she wasn't actually German. "You're not German," he said. "It wasn't a question." Isabel set down her notebook. "This is complicated, I think. Not German, not fully French anymore, captured with German forces. This makes me what? Enemy to my own country also, perhaps." Marcus understood something about being caught between categories, about the way circumstances could make you something other than what you actually were. He settled himself on the ground, a few feet away from her, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough to indicate the conversation wasn't over. "What was your job before the war?" he asked. Isabel smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he had seen on her face. "I made cloth beautiful. My family. We had a textile business. Very boring work, very important to me. I liked the patterns, the dyes, the way you could take something plain and make it extraordinary." She paused, her expression shifting. "Then the Germans came, and I made cloth for uniforms instead of beautiful things. Then I made communications work for them. Then I was captured, and now I sit in a prisoner camp in Mississippi writing letters that never arrive." She said it all with remarkable calm, as if recounting someone else's story rather than her own. But Marcus caught the precise moment when her control wavered. Her fingers clenched against the notebook, and her eyes dropped away from his. "Do you speak French?" she asked abruptly, as if trying to change the trajectory of the conversation. A little, Marcus said. My captain recommended I start learning it. Never know when it might be useful in a facility like this. And I had a friend in basic training, Creole from New Orleans. He taught me some things before he shipped out. Not quite the same as what you speak, I imagine. Isabel nodded slowly. If you have time, perhaps you could practice with me. I speak German very well now, but I forget French sometimes. This is bad. It is my country. I should not forget my country. There was something vulnerable in the request, something that suggested it was about more than just language practice. It was about holding on to something, about maintaining a connection to home in a place that had no connection to anything she recognized. I could do that, Marcus said. Evenings maybe, after roll call. That gives us light, and there are fewer prisoners in the recreation area. We could sit outside the northeast corner, and you could correct my terrible accent. Isabel looked at him directly then, and Marcus caught the full force of that green-eyed gaze that had captured his attention on her first day at the facility. There was gratitude in her expression, but also something else. Caution, perhaps. An understanding of how these small kindnesses could become something else if they weren't carefully managed. Merci, Sergeant Webb, she said formally. This is kind. Marcus, he said. When we're not on duty, just Marcus. And it's not kind, it's practical. My captain wants me to learn French. You want to remember French. Both of us get what we need. He stood, brushing dust from his uniform, already regretting the conversation because he could feel the way it was going to complicate everything. But he had offered, and now he was committed, and some part of him, the part he wasn't proud of, was quietly pleased about that commitment. The French lessons began the following evening. They sat in the quietest corner of the recreation yard, far enough from the other prisoners and guards that their conversation would be private, but visible enough that there was no appearance of impropriety. Isabel brought a small notebook, and she began teaching him French words and phrases with the methodical patience of someone trained in technical communication. But gradually, without either of them quite planning it, the lessons transformed into something more. They stopped being about language and started being about story. Isabel told him about Lion, about the textile business, about her family, about the way the German occupation had crept in gradually, a slow theft of normalcy that happened so incrementally you didn't fully understand what you had lost until it was already gone. Marcus told her about Detroit, about the careful navigation of growing up black in a city that had only recently admitted that racial inequality was something worth addressing, about his father's determination that Marcus would have opportunities he had never had, about his decision to join the army, partly because it seemed like a path forward, and partly because it was the only escape route he could see from a city that, despite its size and importance, could feel like a very small cage. They spoke in a mixture of English and French, Marcus's accent terrible but improving, Isabel's French returning to her with the ease of language spoken in childhood. They didn't touch, not once, not even when the evening breeze picked up and Marcus instinctively shifted slightly closer to shield her from the wind. They maintained the careful distance that was required, the visible restraint that proved nothing was happening other than two people practicing languages. But the distance between them felt charged with something nonetheless. Every evening when Marcus arrived for the lesson, he was acutely aware of Isabel standing to greet him. Every moment they sat on the bench in that corner of the compound, he was hyper-aware of exactly how many inches of space separated them. Every word they exchanged was freighted with meanings that had nothing to do with grammar or vocabulary. November arrived, and with it came cooler temperatures that made the compound feel slightly less like an oven. The leaves on the few trees scattered around the facility began to turn, though Mississippi's version of autumn was pale and brief compared to what either Marcus or Isabel was accustomed to. It was during one of these November evenings, when the air had finally cooled enough to be almost pleasant, that Isabel asked him something that changed the tenor of their conversations entirely. "Why do you do this?" she asked, not looking at him as they sat on their usual bench. The lessons, the time you give. You could assign this duty to another guard, a younger man who has less responsibility, but you come every evening yourself. Why? Marcus was silent for a long moment, understanding that this was not actually a question about language instruction, that she was asking something much more fundamental about his motivations and intentions. The question hung between them like a test neither of them was entirely ready to take. "Because you asked," he said finally, "and because nobody else here speaks French well enough to help you properly, and because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully in a way that suggested this mattered. "Because it's quiet here in these evening hours, and for a little while I can be something other than a sergeant. I can just be someone who's also far from home, trying to remember a language that reminds him of something better than military hierarchy and careful boundaries, and the constant awareness that one mistake could be used against him." He hadn't meant to say that last part. It slipped out before he could stop it, an admission of something he had spent his entire adult life learning not to say out loud. Isabel turned to look at him directly then, and Marcus caught the exact moment when she made a decision about something. Her expression shifted from guarded to something approaching vulnerable, the careful military bearing she maintained around everyone else relaxing in a way that suggested she was giving him permission to do the same. "I'm afraid," she said quietly. "In German, I learned to be afraid without letting it show. The occupiers did not want to see fear. They wanted to see compliance. So I learned to keep my face blank and my emotions carefully controlled. But here, alone with you, speaking my own language, I cannot maintain that control anymore. So I am afraid instead. Afraid of what I am becoming, afraid that this camp is becoming more real to me than the country I came from, afraid that when the war ends and I am released, I will not recognize myself in the life I am supposed to return to." Marcus understood that she was offering him something precious, not her body, not anything physical that could be punished or questioned, but her genuine honesty, stripped of the careful protective layers she maintained around everyone else, the walls she had built to survive occupation and capture and displacement. "That fear is reasonable," he said slowly. "Everything you knew is changing. You're changing. That's natural. Nothing about your circumstances has remained constant. But you won't forget who you are. You're learning French again. You're working. You're surviving. You're thinking about cloth and textile patterns instead of just enduring. Those are the things that matter. I am surviving because of you," Isabel said, and there was something in her voice that made it clear she understood exactly what she was admitting. "You have shown me kindness when I expected cruelty. You have treated me with dignity when you could have simply maintained distance. You have made this place bearable in ways I cannot fully explain. If you were not here, I think I would not survive this. And that means I will be forever grateful to you, forever indebted to you. This is a dangerous kind of feeling, I think, to know that your survival is connected to one person." Marcus felt the words land between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in ways that couldn't be predicted or contained. He wanted to reassure her. He wanted to tell her that his presence didn't matter, that she was stronger than she believed, that she would survive anything. But those would have been lies. Instead, he said quietly, "You don't owe me anything. Being kind isn't about creating debt. It's just about seeing someone who needs help and offering it. That's all this is." But they both knew that wasn't true anymore. Somewhere in the past weeks, between the first conversation and this evening when the air was cool enough to almost feel comfortable, something had shifted. The careful boundaries of guard and prisoner, of professional duty and personal connection, had begun to blur in ways that were impossible to ignore or correct. December arrived, and with it, the approach of Christmas. The camp administration, under Colonel Richardson's direction, decided to allow a modest celebration for the prisoners. They would have a special meal. They would be permitted to sing carols. They would receive small care packages that had been coordinated through religious organizations. Marcus found himself assigned to help coordinate the effort, which meant spending additional time in the women's compound, organizing activities, setting up tables, creating an atmosphere that was as close to festive as a prisoner of war facility could achieve. Every moment of this work meant being near Isabel without the excuse of language lessons to explain the attention he was paying to her specific movements through the space. She worked alongside the other prisoners, helping organize decorations that had been made from paper and scrap materials. She moved with the same careful grace she brought to everything, her hands precise as she arranged items on the tables. And every time she moved past Marcus, there was that moment where they shared a look that contained everything they weren't saying. 3 days before Christmas, Captain Holloway called Marcus into her office. She was a careful woman, not given to dramatic confrontations, but her expression was serious as he sat across from her desk. "I've noticed you and Rousseau spending considerable time together during the recreation periods," she said, without preamble, "language lessons according to the logs. Is that accurate?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. She was struggling with German and wanted to maintain her French. "I thought it would be good for morale and for my own language skills." The captain leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "The rules around fraternization are clear, Webb. Guards and prisoners maintain distance. Professional boundaries are maintained. I assume you're aware of this." "I am, ma'am. We've maintained appropriate distance. The lessons are conducted in the recreation area where they're visible. There's nothing improper in the arrangement." "I'm not accusing you of anything improper," the captain said. "I'm simply stating what I've observed and asking you to be cognizant of how things might appear, especially given your position. There are people who would very much like to find fault with how you perform your duties. People who are waiting for any excuse to suggest that a black sergeant shouldn't be in a position of authority over anyone. Those are just the facts of the situation we're operating in. I'm telling you this not to reprimand you, but to make sure you understand the stakes." Marcus felt the familiar weight of that knowledge settle across his shoulders. He had grown up with it, had carried it through basic training, had maintained awareness of it through every interaction that could potentially be questioned. "I understand, ma'am. I'll reduce the frequency of the lessons." "Don't reduce them," the captain said. "Just maintain better awareness of how they might be perceived. Rousseau is benefiting from the contact. The other prisoners have noticed that her morale has improved. I'm not going to interfere with something that's clearly good for the facility as a whole, but I need you to be smarter about it, more visible, more clearly professional. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "I can do that." But that conversation changed something in the dynamic between them. The evening lessons continued, but now they were joined occasionally by other prisoners who wanted to practice languages. The intimate one-on-one time that had characterized their meetings was interspersed with group instruction that was carefully neutral and professional. Isabel seemed to understand immediately why the dynamic had shifted. She didn't question it, but her eyes carried a new sadness when they looked at Marcus. An understanding that the small space they had created for themselves had been discovered and was now being dismantled. The year turned from 1944 into 1945, bringing with it the knowledge that the war in Europe was entering its final stages. News filtered into the camp through official channels and whispered conversations carried on late into the night. Germany was failing on all fronts. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Allies were advancing steadily. It was only a matter of time before the entire Nazi regime would fall into ruin. And in early January, the news that changed everything arrived in the form of official correspondence from the War Department. German prisoners of war would begin repatriation procedures immediately. Women would be among the first to be processed for return to Germany. Most of the women at Camp Shelby would be transported within weeks, no later than mid-February, according to the preliminary notices. The announcement struck the women's compound like a physical blow in the stomach. The shock of it rippled through every conversation, every work detail, every recreation period. Many of them had, despite themselves, begun to settle into the rhythms of captivity. They had found routines that made existence bearable. They had formed friendships with American guards and other prisoners. They had begun, in some fundamental way, to adjust to their circumstances and to the possibility that they might spend months or even years in American custody before being returned home. Now all of that was being taken away from them in a matter of weeks. And for Marcus, standing at the gate of the women's compound when the announcement was being made, it meant that the careful balance he had maintained, the professional distance he had worked so hard to preserve, was about to become irrelevant. Because Isabel was going to be gone, and he would be left with nothing but the memory of conversations conducted in a mixture of English and French, the memory of careful distances maintained across benches in the recreation yard, the memory of one brief moment when his hand had almost touched hers, and both of them had understood exactly what that almost touch meant. He understood, in that moment, when Captain Holloway read the repatriation orders, that he had only weeks left to figure out what Isabel meant to him and whether he had the courage to do anything about it beyond holding it in his heart where no one else could see it. The final morning arrived before either Marcus or Isabel felt ready for it. The repatriation announcement that had come weeks earlier had become suddenly impossibly real. The transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Shelby at 7:30 in the morning. The women were lined up in their best uniforms, carrying their few possessions in small bags. They were to be transported to New York, where they would be processed and placed on ships bound for Bremen and a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Marcus maintained his professional bearing throughout the morning. He supervised the roll call with the same attention to detail he brought to every task. He ensured that all the proper paperwork was completed. He helped load luggage onto the truck with the same efficiency and precision he had brought to every detail of his work at Camp Shelby. But his heart was performing a different calculation entirely. Each uniform folded, each signature on a document. Each minute that ticked away was 1 minute closer to the moment when he would no longer have access to Isabel's physical presence. The women were assembled in formation for one final accounting. Captain Holloway read through the names slowly, deliberately, as if she understood that this reading mattered, as if she understood that some of these women had changed fundamentally during their time at the camp, that some of them carried with them connections that would follow them across an ocean and across years and across all the circumstances that the world would throw at them. When Isabel's name was called, Marcus forced himself not to look at her. Any sign of recognition could create complications. Any sign of connection could raise questions that neither of them could adequately answer. He kept his eyes forward. He maintained his military bearing. He was the perfect soldier in every way except for the fact that his entire world was walking toward a truck that would carry her away from him. But when the moment came for the women to actually board, when the prisoners began moving toward the canvas-covered vehicle, Isabel paused for just an instant as she walked past where Marcus was standing. Their eyes met, and in that final moment of direct visual contact, Marcus saw everything he felt reflected back at him. The love, the fear, the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, against every rational piece of evidence that suggested their connection, could never survive what came next. This connection would endure. Then she turned away and climbed into the truck with the other women. The canvas covering was pulled closed. The driver climbed into the cab. The engine started with a rumble that seemed to shake through Marcus's entire being, and the truck began to move toward the gate of the camp. Marcus stood at attention as it passed, watching the canvas covering as if he could somehow see through it to where Isabel sat inside, making her own journey toward an uncertain future. The truck disappeared through the entrance to the camp, and Marcus understood with absolute clarity that his life had just been divided into before and after. Before, he had known what it meant to love someone with such intensity that losing them felt like losing a fundamental part of himself. And after, when he would spend every moment figuring out how to bring her back to him. The weeks that followed were the longest of Marcus's military career. He found himself unable to concentrate on routine duties. He performed them anyway with mechanical precision because that was what was expected of him. But his mind was constantly elsewhere, imagining where Isabel was, what she was experiencing, whether she was safe and healthy, and thinking of him the way he was thinking of her every moment of every day. He requested a transfer, which was denied. The army was in no rush to reassign experienced personnel, particularly not personnel with his particular skill set and his particular ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. He applied for compassionate leave, which was also denied. He wrote letters through official channels requesting assistance in locating Isabelle Rousseau among the displaced persons being processed in Germany, and most went unanswered. A few received brief, impersonal responses indicating that locating specific individuals among displaced persons was not possible through official channels. But he did not give up. He reached out to the Red Cross personally. He contacted religious organizations that were working with refugees in Europe. He attended lectures by military chaplains who were involved in relief work, and after each lecture, he spoke to the speaker about his situation. He found every official and unofficial channel available to someone trying to locate one specific person in the chaos of post-war Europe. He also wrote letters. Dozens of them. He wrote to the address of the displaced persons camp where he believed Isabel would be processed. He wrote to care of the American military government in Munich. He wrote through the Red Cross with the hope that they might somehow find her. Most of these letters disappeared into bureaucratic machinery and were never answered. But Marcus did not interpret their silence as rejection. He interpreted it as the simple reality of trying to locate one person among millions of displaced people in post-war Europe. He kept writing. He kept searching. He refused to accept that Isabel was lost to him permanently. He had promised her that he would wait, and Marcus Webb was a man who kept his promises. He wrote to her at addresses he could only guess at. He included his own address with every letter, hoping that somehow, through some mechanism he couldn't predict, his letters would find their way to her. He told her about his daily life, about work at the camp, about Captain Holloway mentioning that she understood what it meant to love someone across impossible boundaries, about the way he wore the piece of her photograph in his wallet next to his heart, a physical reminder that she was real and that their connection had been real. His fellow guards noticed the change in him. He had been a man defined by careful control and professional distance. Now he seemed like someone operating at only half presence, as if a fundamental part of him had been transported away with Isabel, and he was simply going through the motions of living until he could be reunited with it. Captain Holloway pulled him aside one evening in late 1945, about 9 months after Isabel had departed the camp. She didn't ask him how he was doing. Instead, she simply said, "Don't give up. I've seen what love can do to a person, and I've seen what happens when someone decides that love is worth fighting for. Don't be the man who gives up on the one thing that matters most. I've been that person once, and I've also been the person who fought. The fighting is worth it." Marcus understood that she was speaking from personal experience. He never learned her full story, but he understood that Captain Holloway had made sacrifices for her own version of love, and that she believed those sacrifices had been worth it. Then, in March of 1946, more than a year after Isabel had been transported from Camp Shelby, a letter arrived at the camp addressed to Sergeant Marcus Webb in handwriting that made his knees nearly buckle. It had taken 8 months to reach him, carried through displaced persons camps and relief organizations and the slow machinery of post-war international mail. The envelope bore multiple postmarks and official stamps indicating it had been opened and inspected by military censors. But the handwriting was unmistakable. The mixture of English and French was unmistakable. After 14 months of silence, after more than a year of uncertainty, Isabel had found a way to reach him. Marcus opened the letter with hands that were shaking so badly he could barely control them. He sat on his bunk in the barracks and had to read the first page 3 times before the words actually penetrated his mind, before he could convince himself that this was real and not some kind of dream that his desperate mind had conjured. "Dear Marcus," she had written, "I hope this letter finds you. I have written many times and never knew if my words were reaching you. But I had to try again. I had to believe that somewhere in this vast and broken world, you were still thinking of me the way I have never stopped thinking of you." She wrote about Germany at length, about finding her family alive but traumatized by what they had endured during the war and the occupation that followed. Her mother was living in a rebuilt section of Lyon, trying to piece together some semblance of normalcy from ruins. His brother was slowly learning to live with memories that seemed to haunt him constantly, experiences he had survived but could never quite articulate. The textile business was gone, seized during the occupation and never returned, existing now only in memory and in old photographs that her mother kept in a wooden box. She wrote about the displaced persons camps in detail, about living in crowded dormitories with women from across Europe, all of them trying to figure out what came next. Polish women, Yugoslav women, Italian women, all of them displaced by war and occupation and the fundamental reorganization of European geography. She described the food, which was better than what she had consumed in the final years of German occupation, but still meager and repetitive. She described the bureaucratic processes of classification and registration, the endless paperwork required to determine status and eligibility and potential destinations. She wrote about nights when she couldn't sleep, lying in the dark thinking of him, wondering if he was safe, wondering if he had moved on, wondering if the love they had found in captivity was the kind of love that could survive separation. She wrote about the weight of not knowing whether Marcus was still waiting for her or whether he had moved on, finding it easier to forget about a woman he had known only briefly in captivity, an episode from wartime that could be neatly shelved away as one of those things that happen in extraordinary circumstances. But then she wrote about hope, about having been granted refugee status through the assistance of American relief organizations that recognized her educational background and her linguistic abilities as valuable assets. About having been offered work as a translator for the military government, managing the occupation of Germany. About having accepted a position that would require her to work in Munich, which was in the American occupation zone. About having saved the money from that work, carefully, penny by penny, marking each deposit as a step toward America, toward him, toward the possibility of a future that seemed too impossible to be real. And then she wrote the words that changed everything for Marcus, words that seemed to contain the entire universe of emotion and hope and desperate yearning. "I have made arrangements to leave Germany. I have been approved for entry to the United States as a displaced person. I am coming to America. The organization that is assisting me has your name and address. I do not know what will happen when I arrive. I do not know what your life looks like now, or whether you still feel the same way as you did when I left Camp Shelby. I know that time has passed and that people change. I know that you may have decided that loving me was a mistake, that the complications it would bring into your life were not worth the reward. But Marcus, I had to try. I had to believe that the love we found in captivity was real enough to survive in freedom. I had to know if you were worth the risk of crossing an ocean and starting over in a new country with nothing but the hope that you might still want me. I had to take the chance that what we felt was not just a function of our circumstances, but something deeper and more real. I do not expect you to answer immediately. I do not expect everything to be simple. The world will not make this easy for us. There will be people who disapprove. There will be people who see our love as a violation of natural order. There will be complications that we cannot yet imagine. But I am coming. I am arriving in Boston on June 15th, 1946. If you are there when I arrive, then I will know that what we felt was real and permanent. If you are not there, then I will understand that the world has moved on and that the people we were in Mississippi are no longer the people we have become. And I will find a way to build a life here anyway, because America has offered me freedom in ways that Germany never could. Either way, Marcus, I needed you to know that you changed my life. You taught me that love was possible even in the darkest circumstances. You taught me that connection across impossible boundaries could be real. You taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply see another person, truly see them, and choose to love them anyway. And whatever happens next, I will carry that knowledge with me forever. With all my love, Isabel. Marcus read the letter 17 times that first night. He read it in the barracks. He read it sitting by the fence. He read it in the mess hall. He read it until the words became so familiar that he could recite them from memory. And with each reading, he felt something crystallize inside him. Hope, certainty, the absolute knowledge that his life was about to change completely. He received official word that Isabel was arriving in Boston on June 15th, 1946. He submitted an emergency leave request immediately, citing a family emergency that technically wasn't entirely false, because loving someone and having the opportunity to finally be reunited with them after more than a year of separation was the most important family matter he could imagine. The request was granted. He arranged transportation to Boston. He took a hotel room near the harbor, spending more money than he could comfortably afford because he wanted to be close to where the ships arrived. And on June 15th, 1946, at 2 p.m, he stood on the platform as the ship pulled into port, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment. He had imagined how she might look, how she might have changed, what he would say when he saw her, but no amount of preparation could have readied him for the reality of it. The passengers began to disembark, hundreds of them, refugees and displaced persons and people trying to start over in America. Most of them looked exhausted, carrying everything they owned in a few pieces of luggage, carrying the weight of everything they had survived in the set of their shoulders and the expressions on their faces. Marcus scanned every single face, looking for the particular shade of copper hair, the green eyes, the familiar bone structure that had haunted his dreams for more than a year. And then he saw her. She was thinner than he remembered, her face carrying the weight of everything she had endured. But she was unmistakably Isabel. She carried a small suitcase and was dressed in a simple coat that had seen better days but had been carefully maintained. She walked down the gangway slowly, carefully, as if she wasn't entirely certain the ground would support her or that this was actually happening. Marcus moved toward her through the crowd of arriving refugees and military personnel. He pushed through the chaos of reunions and immigration officers and relief workers. His heart was pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. After more than a year of uncertainty, after 14 months of not knowing if he would ever see her again, she was suddenly real and present and walking toward American soil. And when he reached her, when he pulled her into his arms in front of God and everyone standing on that Boston dock, he felt something break open inside his chest. The careful restraint that had defined his entire life seemed suddenly unnecessary. The professional distance that had been so important seemed meaningless. All the years he had spent learning to control his emotions, to maintain boundaries, to present a composed exterior, seemed like they had been preparing him for exactly this moment, when he would abandon all of it. "Isabel," he said, holding her face in his hands, searching every feature as if he was trying to memorize her all over again. "You came back. You actually came back. I told you I would," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I promised you that I would find a way, and here I am. Whatever comes next, Marcus, we will figure it out together." They stood there on the dock for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, holding each other in the midst of the chaos of immigration processing and reunions happening all around them. Marcus didn't care who saw. He didn't care if it was inappropriate or if people were staring. He had spent more than a year in a state of perpetual uncertainty, and now he had her back, and nothing else mattered. They spent the first week in Boston, finding a small apartment that welcomed them, despite the complicated reality of their relationship. They explored the city. They ate meals together in restaurants where no one knew them, and no one seemed to question their presence together. They talked constantly, trying to compress all the things they had wanted to say to each other over the past year into these precious moments. Isabel told him about her experience in Germany, about the shock of finding her homeland in ruins, about her family's complicated survival, about the kindness of some Americans and the hostility of others, about the slow process of rebuilding not just her life, but her sense of identity and belonging. Marcus told her about his continued work at the camp, though the repatriations had largely ended and the facility was being repurposed. About Captain Holloway's continued support, about his own slow process of deciding what came next for him, now that he had found something worth fighting for. 3 months later, they married in a small ceremony in a Boston church. It wasn't elaborate. There was no white dress. Isabel wore a simple blue suit that she had carefully saved money to purchase. There were no hundreds of guests, just a handful of people they had managed to connect with. But there was love so profound that everyone who attended could feel it, like a physical presence in the room. They built a life together that honored both their past and their future. Isabel became a translator for the State Department, using her linguistic skills to bridge gaps between languages and cultures. Marcus eventually left the military, a decision that surprised some, but that felt absolutely right to him. He became an educator, teaching history to students who would never fully understand the weight of the choices their parents and grandparents had made during wartime. He wanted young people to understand that history was not abstract, that it had real human consequences, that ordinary people made extraordinary choices in extraordinary times. They had 2 children, both bilingual, both carrying within them the legacy of a love that had been born in a prisoner of war camp and had survived distance, time, and the chaos of post-war reconstruction. Their daughter Marie became a lawyer. Their son James became a musician. Both of them grew up knowing the story of how their parents met, understanding that love was worth fighting for, understanding that the circumstances of your birth and the identity you were given were not limitations, but starting points. 20 years later, on a warm summer evening in 1964, Marcus and Isabel sat on their porch in Connecticut, watching their youngest daughter practice tennis in the yard. Isabel leaned her head on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture so natural and familiar it had become the rhythm of their everyday life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Loving me, all the complications it caused for your career, all the people who questioned our relationship, all the sacrifices." "Never," Marcus said, "not for a single moment. You were the best decision I ever made." Isabel smiled, and Marcus saw in that smile all the years they had spent together. The early struggles when they were building their life from nothing, the moment their first child was born, the careful navigation of a world that didn't always understand a black sergeant and a white French woman building a life together. The quiet moments like this one, where everything felt perfect and complete. "I was so afraid," Isabel said, "that what we felt in that camp was just the intensity of captivity, that it would disappear once we were free." "But it didn't," Marcus said. "It grew. It became real in ways that I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting on a bench in Mississippi talking to you in broken French." Isabel turned to face him, and Marcus leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, carrying within it 2 decades of love and commitment, and the absolute certainty that he had made exactly the right choice on that afternoon when he had decided to stop pretending and start being honest about what he felt. Later that evening, as they were preparing for bed, Isabel opened a drawer in her nightstand and removed the torn photograph of Marcus that she had given him on that final evening at Camp Shelby. She had carried it with her through Germany, through displaced persons camps, through the entire journey to America. She had kept it safe all these years, a talisman against the fear that their connection might be temporary. "I still have mine too," Marcus said, removing his wallet and showing her where the piece of Isabel's photograph still resided after more than 20 years. The wallet itself was falling apart from age and use, the leather barely holding together, but the photograph remained protected inside, a sacred object that Marcus had carried with him every single day of their separation, and every single day since. He had never once been without it. They looked at the two pieces of photograph, fragments that had been separated and carried across an ocean and through years of war and displacement and uncertainty. And then they placed them together on the nightstand, and they fit perfectly, creating an image of a moment when two people had decided that love was worth the risk. It was a moment frozen in time from more than 2 decades earlier, and yet it contained within it all the moments that had come after, every conversation, every kiss, every difficult negotiation with a world that hadn't wanted to accept their love, every moment of pure joy when they realized they had made it. They had survived. They had built something real and lasting and beautiful from the fragile connection that had been born on a bench in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi. Isabel placed her hand over the combined photograph. "Do you remember that day?" she asked. "When you first asked me if I was all right?" Marcus smiled. "I remember thinking that you seemed sad. I remember wanting to understand why." "I was more than sad," she said. "I was lost. I had no idea where I was or what my future held. And then you asked that one simple question, and you treated the answer like it mattered. You looked at me like I was a person rather than just a prisoner, just an enemy, just a means to an end." "You were a person," Marcus said. "You still are. You always have been." Isabel leaned against him, and they stood together in the darkness of their bedroom, two people who had found each other in impossible circumstances, and who had somehow managed to build something beautiful and lasting from that improbable beginning. The next morning, their daughter Marie called from New York, where she had just been promoted to junior partner at her law firm. She was working on civil rights cases, representing people who were being denied housing or employment based on race or national origin. She had inherited her parents' commitment to breaking down barriers, to seeing people past the categories that the world tried to put them into. "Mom and Dad," she said, "I wanted to tell you myself before you heard it from anyone else. The firm is taking on a case involving employment discrimination, and I volunteered to be the lead attorney. I thought of you too. I thought about your story, about how you didn't let the world tell you who you could or couldn't be together." Marcus and Isabel were both silent for a moment after she told them. Then Isabel said, "We are so proud of you, so very proud. You understand what we have been trying to teach you all your life, that love and justice are connected, that standing up for what is right matters more than comfort or safety." Their son James, who was a musician performing in orchestras throughout New England, had recently announced his engagement to a man he had met at Juilliard. When they first told Marcus and Isabel, James had been nervous, worried about their reaction, worried about judgment. But Marcus had simply said, "Son, your mother and I met in a prisoner of war camp. We built our life together against every obstacle the world could throw at us. If there is one thing I understand, it is that love finds its own path. Love is love. And what matters is that you have found someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses to be with you anyway." James had started to cry, and Isabel had said, "We will be at your wedding. We will celebrate you, and we will remember that it was our love that taught us how to recognize love in all its forms." That evening, as Marcus and Isabel sat on their porch again, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, they reflected on the legacy they were building, not just their own love story, but the example they were setting, the understanding they were passing on to the next generation about what was possible when you chose courage over fear, connection over isolation, honesty over careful restraint. People often asked them over the years how they had managed to stay together despite everything. Despite the racial prejudice, despite the skepticism from both communities, despite the practical complications and the social judgment and the countless small moments when the world tried to tell them that their love was impossible, and Marcus and Isabel's answer was always the same. We made a choice. Every single day, we made a choice to believe in each other. Every time the world told us it was impossible, we chose to believe that love was possible. Every time someone questioned our relationship, we chose to stand firm in our commitment. But more than that, they said, we remembered why we chose each other. We remembered the specific moment when Marcus asked if I was all right, and I realized that someone finally saw me as a person. We remembered the conversations in French and English. We remembered the careful distance we maintained. We remembered the first kiss. We remembered the promise we made that we would find a way to be together. And we held onto those memories. We let those memories sustain us through the difficult times. The love that had been born on a bench in a Mississippi prisoner of war camp in 1944 had not merely survived. It had thrived. It had built a life, created children, influenced everyone who knew them to believe in the transformative power of choosing connection over fear, hope over despair, and love over the careful maintenance of boundaries that had never meant anything in the first place. Marcus and Isabel Webb had proven through their own lives that even in the most impossible circumstances, when the world seemed deliberately designed to keep people apart, love could find a way. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was to stop being careful and start being honest about what their heart needed to survive. They had not just survived. They had built something magnificent, and they had shown the world that it was possible.